All right, we are live. Welcome to everybody joining in, and for everyone who will join later. My guest needs no introduction. However, I will introduce him for those very few people on the planet that don't know who he is. So, I'll make sure I'm good there. Okay. Dr. Gary Habermas is the author or co-author of over 40 books and 100 articles and reviews in journals and magazines. In the last 16 years, he's given over 1,500 lectures in about 100 universities, seminaries, and colleges. He holds a PhD in history and philosophy of religion from Michigan State University, as well as an MA in philosophical theology from the University of Detroit. He currently acts as Distinguished Research Professor and Chair in the Department of Philosophy and Theology at Liberty University, where he has taught for the past 30 years. His main areas of research include the philosophical study of miracles, near-death experiences, the historical Jesus, and the historicity of the resurrection. He is also one of my former professors, I'm proud to say, and so I'm glad to have you here. I appreciate you joining me. I know your schedule is extremely busy, so thank you.
Join and looking forward to it, Alex. Glad to be on with you.
Sounds good. All right. Well, is there anything else? Well, actually, we'll get into what you're working on in a second. I want to make sure we maximize your time. For those that, if you have a question for Dr. Habermas, this might be your one shot. So throw it in there. I'll try to catch it in the chat if I can, but I do have some things we want to kind of unpack here. So let's go back to you defending your dissertation. Obviously, like I said, at the Michigan State University, and your dissertation was pertaining obviously to the resurrection. I believe, correct me if I'm wrong, that you said something to the effect of, or they said something to the effect of, you can do it, but you can't use the Bible, or you can't use a lot of scriptures, or something along those lines. And you said, okay, not a problem. And the rest is history.
Yeah, it was like that.
What came out of that, or how did that conversation?
They didn't mind me using the New Testament. That's what a lot of people don't understand. They'll go, yeah, but you're still using the New Testament. Yeah, well, see, you're not getting the point. Not you, Alex, but I mean, when people say that, critics, atheist New Testament scholars will allow you to use verses, but they will only use verses that are true for certain reasons. There's backup for them. For example, Bart Ehrman, probably the best known skeptic in North America, he's an atheist New Testament scholar. He gives 15 sources for the crucifixion of Jesus. Most of them are in the New Testament. A number of them are not in the New Testament, but he gives 15 different sources, and he has no problem citing texts like 1 Corinthians 15:3 and many other passages that come with good evidence. So it's a myth that critics don't let you use the New Testament. That's what people say when they don't understand history and don't understand where scholarship is. They'll just say, oh, you're cheating. You're using the New Testament. It's a prejudiced book. Well, Bart Ehrman would correct them. Oh, by the way, there's a statement in Bart Ehrman's Did Jesus Exist? Where he says, why do I use the New Testament? Do I use it because it's the New Testament and I'm quoting the New Testament? He says, absolutely not. That's not why I'm using it. I use it because there are some passages that correspond to what we know about things. And those are the passages I use. I don't use the ones that I don't think are good. But the point is, he uses a lot of them. He will outquote evangelicals with passages many times, but he knows which ones he's using and why he's using them.
Absolutely. So. Yeah. I remember, I got some of his stuff up here actually. And I released a video on Easter, and there's a long clip of him that's kind of now infamous, I guess, where he's saying, basically he's rebuking atheists who say that Jesus was a myth and never existed. And he kind of, he's almost an apologist for us in that sense. And I've met him. He's a really nice guy, actually. So
he is a nice guy, but he's an atheist New Testament scholar who I think a lot of people, I'm not going to make people happy when I say this, but he is a nice guy, like you said, and he's pretty fair with the data. He lets you use data if they're truly data. Now, you can argue about certain things, but for the majority of things, we're going to use the same verses.
Wow. Well, that says a lot right there. So let's kind of jump into this defense that you created, sometime decades ago now, I guess, at Michigan State. And if you can, you don't have to give us the entire thing, but there's the 6 facts, and then you can go all the way to 12, I guess. But maybe give us the most facts that you think will help us to understand that these are facts that every scholar, once again, we're talking about scholars, agree on surrounding the events before the crucifixion and after crucifixion regarding the disciples, empty tomb, or whatever have you. What are those facts?
Well, yeah, and the way I say it is, I mean, you can take a skeptic like Rudolf Bultmann in the last century, or Bart Ehrman in this century, and I don't know, because this part of it doesn't interest me, but if you comb their works for everything that they think is an historical fact, maybe of the dozens and dozens and dozens in the New Testament, they might think there's 20 good ones. Maybe they think there's 30. But I'll come along almost as if I'm the liberal. Now, that's not true, but I'll say, I'll tease with them sometimes, and I'll say, wow, you're going to admit 30 facts? I don't need 30 facts. I don't need 20. Let me start with a dozen. And here's a dozen that almost everybody agrees to. One of them is like 2/3, but all the rest of them are probably in the 90 percentile. And then I'll say, a dozen? Nah, that's way too conservative. I'll only use 6. And so nobody only gives me 6, but almost nobody will argue with you on any of the 6. And actually, the use of these came out of my own doubts years ago when I was doing my master's degree. And I had doubts about the resurrection. And what I kept doing with myself was, how many bricks does it take to make a wall? Well, how many facts does it take to show this happened to Jesus, this happened to Jesus? And I kept making the list shorter and shorter and shorter to see what I could come up with. And there are times when I've only used 3. But for the most part, I'll use 6. And then I'll add the empty tomb, because the evidence is there for the empty tomb, but it's only granted by about 75% of scholars and not 95% like the rest of them. So I'll call it 6 plus 1, 6 that everybody gives you, and 1, the empty tomb, for which the evidence is solid, but only about 3/4 of the scholars will give it to you. So that's kind of the way I roll with these 6 plus 1.
So what are the 6 in short version?
Okay. Short version. Jesus died by crucifixion. Now, that doesn't support the resurrection, but if he's not dead, he's not raised. So we have to have him dead. Jesus died by crucifixion. Number 2, his disciples had experiences, real experiences, that they believed were appearances of the risen Jesus. Now, there's a real simple way to say that. After the crucifixion, they thought they saw Jesus alive again. Okay. Thirdly, and this one has been really, really bolstered by the evidence. It's been granted for a long time, but it's really been bolstered lately. And that is, they began proclaiming this not when the Gospel of John came out, plus 65 years after the crucifixion, not when Matthew and Luke came out, that people date to 50-55, critics, not when Mark came out at plus 40, not when Paul's first epistle, probably First Thessalonians, came out at plus 20, but according to Gerrit Ludemann, the atheist New Testament scholar, these experiences were reported immediately. I think that fits the definition of early. Okay. 4, they turned the world upside down from these. The big 4, James, the brother of Jesus, Paul, Peter, and John, the big 4, we have first century sources for the martyrdom of 3 of the 4, and a second century source for the martyrdom of John. But you can't prove all the other disciples died martyrdom. So I just say they were willing to die. And sometimes people say to me, well, how do you know they're willing to die? What are you, a brain reader? You just read minds? What? I'll say, no, I don't read minds. I read feet. I watch where they go. If you go to the same place over and over again where you've been beat up, stoned, kicked out, whipped many, many times, you're either really dumb or you have a really important purpose for going there. One or the other. You're either really smart or you're not too smart. And nobody says the disciples, nobody would say Paul was dumb. Nobody would say that. Anthony Flew, my atheist philosopher buddy, until he became a theist later in his life, Anthony Flew said we used to call Paul a major first century philosopher. And so Paul's not dumb. So they reported these things and they were willing. Their feet, they kept going in places where they could get hurt and did get hurt. Okay, then 4 and 5, 2 skeptics become believers because they think they saw the risen Jesus. And those 2 skeptics are James, the brother of Jesus, and Saul of Tarsus, later called the Apostle Paul. So those are my 6, real fast. Crucifixion, they thought they saw Jesus, proclaimed early, lives transformed, 2 skeptics, James, the brother of Jesus, and Saul, later Paul of Tarsus.
Sounds pretty solid to me. I remember, I think I did a video on my own of Easter. I did one for Good Friday and Easter because, like you said, if there's no crucifixion, there's no resurrection. And one of the things that was really, unless somebody has a bias against the supernatural, have you heard any halfway legitimate? I mean, hallucination makes absolutely no sense. The swoon theory, I think, is pretty well debunked. The stolen body, like conspiracy theory. What is there any halfway naturalistic theory that you've heard and said, okay, maybe, I don't think so, but maybe, or have you not? I don't know.
Not a naturalistic theory. Now, let me define a naturalistic theory so we're all on the same page.
Okay.
I would say a naturalistic theory is this. Jesus didn't rise from the dead. What really happened was, and you fill in the blank. And if you don't fill in the blank, and all you say is, no, Jesus didn't rise from the dead, that's a denial, but it's not a naturalistic theory. A naturalistic theory is when you tell me what you think happened in its place, and you name some of those. For example, the disciples stole the body. That arguably has not been actually held by a scholar for about 250 years. Since the mid 1700s, it's just not real popular. But it's in the New Testament. It's recorded in the New Testament. Somebody thought that. Nobody taught it, but in Matthew 28, the Jewish leaders are portrayed as saying he might steal a body.
Right before the bribe, though.
Right?
Right before they bribed them to say that.
Excuse me. Yeah, but back to your question, I don't think there's a naturalistic theory that would make me slow down. And somebody would say, well, that's because you're prejudiced. That's because you're Christian. No, I mean, well, let me put it this way. I've got a major volume coming out. It might be a couple years before it comes out. But it's a volume on the naturalistic theories. And the longest treatment of naturalistic theories in print today, of which I'm aware, is my good friend Mike Lacona's in his 700-page dissertation, and it's 250 pages of refutations. It's great. He does a great job. Best book in print now on the resurrection. This volume I'm talking about, there you go. There it is. Yeah, if I pulled mine out, the pages are coming out. I had to type them. That's good. That's a great book.
Look how thick it is.
Good picture in the front. There you go. There you go. Yeah, well, I'm working on a volume now that's 1,100 pages against naturalistic theories. 1,100 pages of reasons. I mean, they just don't quit. There's plenty. Well, now, people get mad at you. They might get mad at you when you say that. They might say, oh, I suppose you believe in God. I mean, they might say anything. But what they don't, generally today, most established scholars who have terminal degrees in relevant fields, I don't care if they're atheist New Testament scholars. I prefer atheist New Testament scholars. They don't want to pick a particular theory. They don't want to go there.
Yeah.
As one told me in a debate, I'm not going to pick it because you're going to come after me and then I'm going to look silly and be in a corner. He literally said that to me. He was an atheist. So they generally will not pick them. And as Bart Ehrman says, Christians want you to pick these theories. They want you to do it. So
it's a good point. Well, yeah, we'll come back to because I wanted to ask you about your kind of magnum opus and that you've referenced. So getting into some more evidence or ways to look at the evidence, maybe. So you and I were talking very briefly about this idea of prospective and respective ways of looking at the facts that we do have, the facts that, like you said, that everybody agrees on such and such a fact. But do we look forward? Do we look back? Can you explain those concepts briefly for us?
Yeah, there are two words that retrospective is a back look, obviously. Prospective is a forward look. So these are not so much proving the resurrection as much as they are asking the question, if there is a resurrection, what does it show? And retrospective says, if in the history of religions, only one man's been raised from the dead, and somebody goes, well, there goes your prejudice again. No, you study the world religions. You tell me what founder of a major world religion is believed by his or her Orthodox followers to be raised from the dead. You're not going to find one. Yeah. Now, if he's the only one in history, well, that's the problem. I don't believe it. Okay, then you refute the evidence. No matter where you go, you're going to have a barb there. So you get the resurrection. If there is a God, why would Jesus be the only one raised in the world? Why would he be raised from the dead? Now, if you go, well, I'll pick a naturalistic theory. Please, go for it. Pick a naturalistic theory. Do it. Be my guest. But if not, you have to think about, it's like an intelligent design kind of argument. I often call it a teleological argument. It's an argument that says somebody bigger and better than us. I mean, we don't raise the dead. We don't create life. We didn't speak life into existence. A dead man who's dead as dead can be was spoken into existence. That requires somebody that we don't know anybody like, personally. And I think the best reason for the prospective looking back is that all the good arguments for God's existence right now, two most real common ones are the Kalam argument, whatever exists, whatever began to exist as a cause, the universe began to exist, therefore the universe has a cause. Or the moral argument is quite hot right now, quite interesting. So there's other arguments for God, and if the resurrection enters this question as an argument for miracle, it points back to God. Prospective looks forward and says, what happens if we have resurrection in terms of theology that the early church preached? And Jesus claimed, even Rudolf Bultmann, even Bart Ehrman would say that Jesus preached the kingdom of God. There's a kingdom. And basically, I'm paraphrasing, but basically, what you do with me determines where you spend eternity. You go, where does he say that? Well, I didn't, I'm paraphrasing. Okay, where does he say it in paraphrasing? Okay, he says, take up your cross and follow me. He says, whoever lays down his life, whoever's left father, mother, will receive rewards in this life and eternal life in the age to come. Over and over, he makes himself the center of where you're going to be for eternity. And don't forget, there's a direct argument here. The resurrection itself is an evidence of life after death. So there's two ways to get life after death from the resurrection. One is Jesus' teachings is that you'll be raised like him. By the way, that's the number one claim in the New Testament that's tied to the resurrection more than any other doctrine, is that believers will be raised like Jesus, almost 20 times. That's just a belief. Right, but you tell me, how would you explain it? So that would be an evidence that Jesus was talking about eternal life. The other one is that the resurrection is eternal life. The resurrection itself is life after death. So that's prospective. That's looking ahead to theology based on the resurrection.
Wow. No, that's really good. And I think thinking about these facts and trying to deal with them. And one thing I've said, depending on the environment, is everybody's got to make a decision on Jesus. Now, theologically, the Bible says every knee shall bow. And the way I've sometimes said it is you decide either if you're going to bow on this side or the next. The problem is if you bow on the other side, you don't get back up. At some point, though, everyone's going to have to wrestle with this. And obviously, our goal is to help them wrestle with it and come to the right conclusion on this side of heaven. With that being said, one of the best evidences, I think in your class, my paper was on this actually, about one of the best evidences that maybe doesn't get talked about a whole lot, but I think Mike Licona does a lot on it. And I'm sure you, and I know you have too, is the initial rise of Christianity is in and of itself a good evidence for some of the reasons you said. For example, the half brothers of Jesus didn't believe he was the Messiah. Now we got to give them a pass. I mean, who's going to believe their big brother is the Messiah? But there's something that changed afterwards, right? And these very pious brothers of his suddenly became they were very proud Jewish young men, as they should be. But now they're doing something, like you said, at the risk of their own life and a whole different message. And so it's about 20 years before there's any letters. So it's not as though they're going off of scriptures per se, at least not New Testament scriptures. So what is this initial rise of Christianity based in, if not the event of the resurrection? And once again, I'm trying to be fair to the naturalist or the skeptic in saying, you got to come with a better explanation to me. Like, what changed that significantly if it's not that? And so with regards to the initial rise of Christianity, what can you tell us that kind of bolsters that as a piece of evidence?
What can I tell you, or what might the critics say?
Both. Yeah.
Well, the critics can say, I'm not going to let you get to first base with this supernatural kind of conclusion. And I will say, I've already said it, but I'll say, good for you. I mean, if that's where you want to go, that's your business. You can say and believe what you want. But if you don't think this is a resurrection, tell me what you think did happen.
Right.
Now, see, they will see that if they're familiar with apologetics, they'll see that as you casting bait out, right? You cast bait and you're getting ready to reel it back in again. You want them to take the bait. Oh, I think there's 100 explanations. Wonderful. Why don't you settle down on one of them? No, I think there's 100. Good. Give me one of them. And by the way, that's a response a lot of them will use today. Anything's a good theory. Why don't you pick one of the anythings then? See, they don't want to go there. They think you're trying to get them in the corner, which is what's going to happen if they pick something. Mm-hmm. But if they want to deny it, if like we said earlier, a naturalistic theory is to fill in the blank. What really happened? It's not a naturalistic theory to say, I don't believe in the resurrection. That's just a denial. And that's your right. But, reject it. Okay, great. You want to go there? That's your business. That's your choice. Choices are good. So, I wish you wouldn't go there, but that's your choice. But if they just keep saying, no, 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 that tells me there's probably something else in their mind. As I often use the phrase, they don't want to get married to Jesus. And the reason I use marriage language is because in the New Testament, the words for believe, the Greek words pisteuo, pistis, those words, they mean, as my Greek professor used to say, those words mean commitment. They don't mean like, well, I believe George Washington's the first president of the United States. It's commitment. It means to rely upon. It means to commit. It means to trust. And it's no joke that in the Old Testament, God was the groom and Israel, the nation Israel, was the bride. In the New Testament, God is the groom and the church is the bride. So the word means to commit, and the stories that are used have to do with marriage, have to do with commitment. And so what a lot of people don't want is a commitment. They act like it's the facts, because nobody wants to be told, you just don't want a commitment, or you're just emotional. Nobody wants to hear that kind of stuff. They'd rather say, oh, it's the facts, dude. You don't have the facts. You don't have the facts. I'll say, please, let's stop. I'll shut up, let you talk. Tell me what you think happened. Oh, I'm not saying that. I'm not saying that. Anything, and there they go again, back to anything else. If they tried, sometimes they'll try one. And I was at Stanford University one time, and I was lecturing, and this guy said, he came down to the microphone, and he said, "You said all the naturalistic theories are shot down." And I said, "Yeah." He said, "But you didn't really give any." I said, "No, I didn't. That's fair. I didn't have enough time." He goes, "Can I make one up?" He was real kind. He was really, really kind. And he said, "Can I make one up?" And I said, "Absolutely." Well, he said maybe the disciple stole the body, which is absolutely the worst one you could take. But he said maybe the disciple stole the body. Well, I always teach my students, when you give refutations, number them. Number one, number two, number three. Because if you don't do that, here's what's going to happen. You might give a half dozen, and people will say later, oh, yeah, he gave 2 or 3 reasons. No, I gave a half dozen. So I was counting them, and I got up to 6. And by the way, I only use the facts that the critics allow, and only using their facts, I got up to 6 and 7. And then I said 8. And when I said 8, this ripple went through the crowd. And you know how sometimes you can interpret ripples in crowds? If someone's laughing or something?
Yeah.
And the ripple was like, sound, dude, to the guy asking the question. And so he got the idea too, because he leans up to the mic and he goes, I'm sorry. And he turns around and runs away from the mic and sits down. It was kind of cute. But so I numbered these reasons, and I said 8, and that's as far as I got. I didn't give 8. I just said 8, and he left the microphone. So I like people. I didn't embarrass him, and he was a really nice guy. But I wanted people to see that there are a lot of good reasons against these suppositions.
Wow, that's embarrassing. I hope he read some of your books afterwards. So let me just ask one more.
I hope it wasn't embarrassing.
I hope so too.
I'm just saying, I hope it wasn't embarrassing. He asked the question, I didn't. I was just answering.
It's funny, but so with regards to the initial rise of Christianity, so what is there in your writing and research? Is there like 1 or 2 things that kind of stand out to you that emphasize the depth or breadth of the initial rise of Christianity, as far as going from Jerusalem to Rome? And as you had mentioned earlier, that they at least were willing to go back to the same places and face the same persecution. Like, what is there within the initial rise of Christianity that you think should stand out to people?
I think, according to Paul, 1 Corinthians 15, he says twice. He uses a different Greek word, but he says twice, if Christ hasn't been raised from the dead, your faith is vain. And I think we keep going back to the resurrection because it's the center. Now, that might upset people because it's hard to get to first base against the resurrection. But we keep emphasizing it because if there's no resurrection, there's no Christianity. Basically, for verses 12 through 19 in 1 Corinthians 15, Paul says, if Christ hasn't been raised, then this isn't true, this isn't true, this isn't true, this isn't true. And finally, in 1 Corinthians 15:19, he said, if Christ has not been raised, we are of all men most miserable. We're the most miserable persons around. And then he says, next verse, 20, but Christ has been raised from the dead and is the first fruits of those who sleep, or those who die. So that would be the key. When they went into towns where they could be hurt, Paul gives lists of things that happened to him. I think he says several times he was given 40 lashes minus 1. He was shipwrecked. He was stoned and left for dead. A lot of things happened to him. Well, don't keep doing what you're doing. No, I have to, because Jesus called me to present the gospel. So that's the key. They kept going back there because of the resurrection. That's why I tell people, when they were willing to die, it wasn't that they were willing to die and starting to talk about their particular brand of theology. They were willing to die specifically for the resurrection, because it's the only key. The resurrection is a key that unlocks the door. They didn't die, let's say, because they thought that God predestined everybody from before the foundation of the world. Nothing wrong with that. But I mean, they didn't die because of some belief about the future events in the world. They died. They were willing to die. Some did die. They were willing to die specifically for the resurrection. That makes us concentrate on the resurrection. That's why we do it.
Well said. Well said. All right. Well, let's move on to something. It's kind of a fun thing to talk about, I guess. The Shroud of Turin. I know you've kind of gone over your course of your career and your study. You've kind of gone back and forth. Where do you stand currently? And let me just say this to everybody. this is not a salvific issue. This is not a hill to die on. It's just, but you're the expert, so I would love to hear your thoughts on it.
Well, yeah, I co-authored a couple books on the Shroud, and my co-author deserves more credit than I get. My co-author was he was the spokesman for the team of scientists who did the investigation in 1978 in Turin, Italy. He was a professor at the Air Force Academy. As the first 4 guys in this famous carpool that started testing the Shroud, they were all professors at the Air Force Academy in Colorado Springs. And my co-author knew that I had just written my dissertation on the resurrection. He had just done his gone with the group over to Turin, Italy, and done the investigation. And he just basically, our very first phone call, we talked for, I don't know, 2 or 3 hours. And the very first phone call, he said, what do you say we put a book together here? I was part of the science. You've done history in the resurrection. Let's work together. And we published a book in 1981. The experimentation was 1978. We published a book in 81. We published a follow-up book in 1990. And I make some Shroud people upset. I don't say the Shroud has to be the burial garment of Jesus. But I think the arguments are pretty good. I think there's a probabilistic argument. I think it's a real archaeological artifact. It really wrapped a man who was crucified. It meets all these medical and other tests. More tests have been done of the Shroud than any other archaeological artifact in human history, secular or religious.
I didn't know that.
And I don't say it has to be, but I think there's some good evidence for it, and it should at least play around. It should be there in the background as contributing evidence here and there for this or that, depending on what question you ask.
Gotcha. Wow, I didn't know that. I mean, it's more than any in history. That's quite a bit, to say the least. Now, you referenced this earlier, so I want to just ask you, since we have you here. I know, I think there's several other people who are doing this now. Actually, I was just watching a video with Stephen Meyer, who did his magnum opus, and I believe you're doing yours, if I'm not mistaken. I heard you talking about it. This must have been maybe last year. I don't know. And I know it's not done yet, but the thing that stood out to me was that you said you had new material. And I'm like, what else could there be? Now, I don't let the cat out of the bag, but is there like one thing you can share with us? Give us like a sneak peek on something new. Actually,
already gave a sneak peek. I think those 6 facts are all exciting. The 6 minimal facts are all exciting. But I think the sneak peek would be my talking about the earliness of the report. You say, well, you sound like a Christian when you say that they started preaching it really early. Okay, but what if I told you, let's just try a few. What if I told you Gerrit Ludemann, the atheist New Testament German professor, says that he's an atheist. He says the preaching of the resurrection, the teaching of the resurrection happened immediately after the experiences, whatever they were. Bart Ehrman says their proclamations were in circulation within 1 to 2 years. James D.G. Dunn, he just passed away, unfortunately, but he's as big a name as there is in New Testament historical Jesus studies. And he said it's very possible that the early creeds that mention the resurrection came out within the same year he was crucified. Same year. 2 Jewish scholars, Gezer Vermesh, professor of Jewish history at Oxford, and Pinchas Lapid, professor. Get this: he's Jewish, non-Christian. He's got a PhD in New Testament. They both say that the evidence for the resurrection is quite outstanding. They both say it disproves the naturalistic theories. Vermesh says, I don't know what to do with it. I'm not sure where to come down. Pinchas Lapid, the other one with the PhD in New Testament, he says Jesus was raised from the dead. He's not a Christian, but he says Jesus was raised from the dead. By the way, when you ask him, he's passed away too now, but when you ask Pinchas Lapid, so if he's not your Messiah, what do you think the resurrection was doing? And I'm pretty sure he takes the view. He's a little hazy about it, but I think he takes the popular Jewish view that Jesus is the Gentile Messiah. He's the Messiah of all non-Jews in the world.
Interesting.
So that's a pretty, I mean, that doesn't grant that, 30 million people are, I suppose, are exempt according to him, Jews, but Jesus is the Messiah for everybody else. I mean, these are major theories, and those 4 people are unbelievers. 2 of them are atheists. So 2 of them are atheists and one's an agnostic. So I'm not sitting here quoting people who are the Baptist pastor down the street and people like that. Nothing wrong with that. I'm just saying you can't get away by saying, "Oh, well, quit quoting Christians to me." Well, you're just you're just showing me what you don't know about the data.
Right. Fair points. Yeah, and I hadn't really heard that argument very much, that the Gentile Messiah. I didn't even know that was a really...
Yeah, it was a popular view that supposedly got its I don't say beginning, but got its real oomph right around the turn of the 1900s, about 120 years ago, and it was held by a guy named Franz Rosenwig. He was a German Jew, and he did this Gentile Messiah thesis, but Jews were exempted. But I mean, I don't believe that thesis. But what I'm saying is, if you think everybody else in the world comes through Jesus, that's a pretty lofty view. I mean, it's not the New Testament view. That's a pretty high view. You wouldn't call that a low view, of Jesus.
Very good point. Wow, a lot to think about. Well, in this lane of evidence, I remember reading in one of your books about, I think, the historical Jesus, and you have a section about ancient Christian sources that are non-New Testament.
Right.
And, I did some stuff looking at, Josephus and Marbar Serapion and, Tacitus, Pliny the Younger, and the ones that we know are not Christian, but are good sources. But I haven't really thought much about the Christian non-New Testament sources. Can you tell us a little bit about that?
Yeah, I argue I have 4 categories in the book. One is non-Christian writers within 150 years of the crucifixion. And that's not very long. I mean, Bart Ehrman will let you go at least 100 years. So 150, and I give a list of about 50 details from the life of Jesus, his claims, his teachings, the early church, and use only non-Christian sources. Okay, Category number 2, you just mentioned them. Christian writers, but they're not in the New Testament.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, third category, archaeological sources, because there are some archaeological sources that are helpful. Yeah. Like, for example, the bones of a crucifixion victim named Johannan, who his bones were discovered in 1968, and he was crucified. Well, the nails were still through his heel bones, and you can tell a lot about death by crucifixion. And he was, we have no reason to doubt he was one of the thousands of Jews who were crucified at that time. So archaeology can help. It gives probably the least, but some of the things it chips in are really helpful. And the last one are these early comments I'm talking about, what are called creeds or traditions that are reported in the New Testament, but they predate the New Testament. Bart Ehrman, the atheist New Testament scholar, he says all the ones Paul cites, and Paul probably cites a dozen to 24 of them. Bart Ehrman says they were probably, or possibly, if not probably, all in existence in Jerusalem before Paul was converted. They're that early. Now, Paul's converted at 2 to 3 years after the cross. So he says they probably all have their birth in Jerusalem before Paul was converted. Paul knew about them. And what's more, he interviewed the guys who said they saw Jesus. He interviewed them. We know that in Galatians 1 and 2. And critics, that's Galatians 1 and 2. The book of Galatians is one of the books critics will let you use. Atheist New Testament scholars will let you use it. And so these early statements, Bart Ehrman says, maybe all of them predate Paul's conversion. And maybe that's why Paul was angry, because he knew what they were preaching. And he thought it was blasphemy. So those 4, non-Christian, obviously outside the New Testament, Christian outside the New Testament, archaeology, and these early sources that could very well predate even Paul's conversion. They're the earliest ones. And that, by the way, go back to your earlier question, that's the most exciting thing that's come out of recent research is these creeds and how early these data points are that proclaim the deity, death, and resurrection of Jesus.
Wow. I'm going to see if we have any questions in the comments, but until we do, I want to ask, you've done obviously probably the most work on the resurrection of anybody, but you've also done a lot of work on near-death experiences more broadly. So I think, even as I consider potentially a PhD or something like that, part of it will be in debunking the epistemic gaps in naturalistic theory. But forget that for a second. The point is this: if any supernatural reality can be proven, naturalism is debunked. And so one of those things that does that, if people accept the evidence, is near-death experiences. I know you can't give us everything because you've done so much work on this, but just what is the research? Because this is, once again, this is not proving Christianity per se, but it gives us another tool in the toolbox to say, well, it does seem to be a supernatural spiritual environment. What could you say briefly on that?
You want me to talk about that a little bit? Is that
it? Yes. Sorry.
You were breaking up a little bit. I couldn't hear everything. I was guessing here. Well, first of all, let me say that near-death experiences are completely different. These aren't resurrections.
Right.
In fact, they're not even death. They're near death. But they're in the same genre as resurrection in this sense. If the 300 evidential near-death experiences, which are around in the literature, many of these, by the way, have been written up in medical journals and very, very reputable sources. If they show you that something happens after death, or in the way we've been using it, in a near-death scenario, and if that points to something probably continuing after the person's death, if that were to happen, we're still talking about afterlife. And what topic are we talking about with the resurrection? Afterlife. So if there is an afterlife, it can work either way. You could argue from Jesus' resurrection to near-death experiences, or you can let near-death experiences open the door to afterlife and then say Jesus' resurrection is a specific case of afterlife. So when I talk about near-death experiences, I concentrate on the 300 cases that I've written on that indicate that something's going on. 36 of those cases, 36 minimum, I'll bet you there's more now, but in 36 cases, the persons who had experiences that could be verified, they see something in the real world that could be verified. A police report, a car accident, things happen. And they can be verified, even though, as far as we can tell, their heart and brain were not working.
Oh.
Their heart and brain were not working. So if we have evidence of some event X after the heart and brain appear not to be working, especially, this can't go on for more than a couple of minutes. If the thing you report happened a half hour later, because we know when you're not breathing. If you're in the hospital, we know when your heart and brain are not working. By the way, and your brain stops working. If your heart stops working with a cardiac arrest, your brain stops working in about 15 seconds.
Wow.
15 seconds, your brain stops working. If you have an evidence at the 5-minute mark, 10-minute mark, 30-minute mark, then that's a likely evidence that something's happened to you when the brain and heart aren't working. So I would use some of those evidential cases. I've argued 20, 30, 40 of them. I mean, there's 300 of them that I know of. And some of them, the evidence is outstanding.
Wow, it's a lot to think about. And I think as we say often, if we look at this as an abductive approach, with all of the evidence for Christianity and for God more broadly, we're not asking anybody to take one little piece and say, well, that proves everything. But it's hard to get away from the quantity of evidence that would support the claims that Christians and Christianity make. So for our last couple of minutes here, unless somebody has questions, I just want to shift real briefly because I know that part of the way you came to your beliefs and even to your theory that you defended was through your moments of doubt. And I think we've all experienced doubt on some level, and we've all experienced loss on some level. And I know that you lost, obviously someone very close to you and your wife, and I've lost both my parents at this point. And so both believers, both faithful, but those things can have an effect on your walk and your faith. And so what could you tell us as far as the hope that is in the resurrection, if it be fact, which it seems that is the case? How do you counsel or respond? Not to say you're doing pastoral counseling, but how do you respond to people who are struggling with times of doubt?
Yeah, first of all, I'll back up a little bit in my personal testimony.
Okay.
Sometimes I'm interviewed by people on radio or television or something. They'll say, I'll bet you did the resurrection because you're just a good guy and you wanted to help people who are going through doubts. And I said, well, I wished I could say I was a good guy and try to help people going through doubts, but I was going through my doubts. I was trying to help me. And the resurrection was my answer to the question, how do I know there's an afterlife? How do I know there's ultimate meaning in life? So I did this. And then after I saw this evidence for the resurrection, I saw that it was meeting people's needs. And so I started doing evidences. Gotcha. Now, earlier we talked about a prospective argument going forward to Christian theology, and taking that path right there. What can the resurrection do for people pastorally? Because the resurrection is tied to almost every area of theology and almost every area of practice in the entire New Testament. And if it's tied to these things, what do we do with this life after death? We keep coming back to life after death in this interview, and we should, because that's what this is about. Well, Paul says in 1 Thessalonians, and by the way, that's one of the books that critics let you use. That's one of the ones that Bart Ehrman uses. In 1 Thessalonians, Paul says, we grieve, but not as those without hope. I mean, whatever you do with it, the Gospel of John says that when Lazarus died, Jesus' buddy, when Lazarus died, Jesus wept. Now, why would Jesus weep when he knows he's going to raise Lazarus from the dead? Because death hurts. Death is painful. And he's watching the two sisters with whom he's also very close. He's watching them in a lot of pain. And so Paul says, we grieve when somebody dies. We grieve. And you're right. I mean, the mother of my 4 children died when she was just 43 years old. She died of stomach cancer. And it was the hardest thing that ever happened to me. And so I understand. Paul says, we expect you to grieve when someone dies. Lazarus, your wife, people in your church. Okay. But Paul goes on to say, we grieve, but not as those without hope. Stop and think about it for a minute. You ever think about the difference between grieving with hope and grieving without hope? If you grieve with hope that you'll see the person again, that makes all the difference in the world. I'm sad because I don't see him now. I'm happy when I think about seeing him later. If you don't have resurrection, the don't see him now, presumably for a lot of people who don't believe, that is the answer forever. You don't see him. So there's one example right there. The resurrection says, the Gospel of John has Jesus saying this, because I live, you shall live also. So the key to resurrection is there's nothing wrong with Christians grieving when their loved ones die, but we don't grieve like somebody who has no hope, because the resurrection ensures believers of eternal life.
Amen to that. We do have a couple questions here. First one is, are there any scholars today, published or otherwise, who say that Jesus did not exist? As I referenced, Bart Ehrman, who is an atheist scholar, says that's ridiculous. But do you know of any?
All right. Bart Ehrman, you brought him up. Bart Ehrman, in his book, Did Jesus Exist? He goes off for 20 pages on people who say Jesus was a make-believe copycat like there were in other religions and ancient Greco-Roman myths. He says no. He says that thousands of people around the world who have accredited terminal degrees, let's say doctor's degrees in New Testament theology, archaeology, classics, history, he says, to my knowledge, Bart Ehrman says, to his knowledge, he does not know a single professor at an accredited college, university, or seminary that says that Jesus didn't exist. So would some say that? Well, he goes on and says, yeah, I know two. He says, I know two with good credentials. And anybody who studies the field knows who the two guys are. There are some guys with good credentials. Neither one is a professor in a, accredited, like Bart Ehrman said, accredited college, seminary, or university. And so Bart's point is still out there on the table, that view is not. No, the answer is not an accredited scholar who holds a teaching position in an accredited school.
There you go. One question here, because this is theory new to me too. So if Jesus was the Messiah to the Gentile only, is the Jews still waiting on their Messiah? And if it's possible to have multiple Messiahs, doesn't that mean their own belief in monotheism is flawed? It's an interesting question.
Yeah. You'd have to let the Jewish persons answer that for themselves, because I'm sure there's a variety of views. I'm sure, you have, with Jews, you have conservative Jews, moderate Jews, liberal Jews, and some are going to not be looking for the Messiah. Some are going to be looking for the Messiah. So there's a variety of views. So I wouldn't know, unless I knew the person or what the belief was, I wouldn't know exactly what they would say. But in the example I gave, Pinchas Lapide and Franz Rosenwig, the German Jew, whose example I gave, they thought that he was not the Jewish Messiah, but he was everybody else's Messiah. That's just one popular view today. And of course, many Jews do think Jesus was a great teacher. In fact, Jesus is the only founder, I think this is true, Jesus is the only founder of a major world religion who's believed to be a great teacher in all the religions of the world. I mean, in the Quran, there's almost 100 verses in the Quran on Jesus. And I know Muslims who say, when they talk about Jesus, they say, Jesus, peace be upon him, just like they say about Muhammad. Now, they think Muhammad was the chief prophet. I'm not pretending they don't. They think Muhammad's the chief prophet, but they treat Jesus very respectfully. So he's viewed that way in all the religions.
Yeah, no, that's a really good point. A couple more here. So in this this day and age of, I'm not going to try to ask you to address all of culture, but in this day and age where feelings and opinions seem to be the preferred epistemological method, which is a very flawed one, obviously, how do we help people? Can you give us kind of an apologetics 101 snapshot of, specifically with non-believers that root their beliefs and opinions in that don't necessarily root their beliefs in historical or archaeological evidence, as you so brilliantly laid it out? How do we get people to rein in their focus outside of, well, I just don't believe it happened, or I just don't think that type of thing happens, or I don't feel like this is a good guy, those types of comments, to get people to focus on the hard data? What kind of novice? I think it depends.
Well, as you yourself know, Alex, having done a master's degree in apologetics, it really helps. You use the phrase having tools in your in your toolbox, or having, different things to go to. I think it depends a lot on what they're saying as to how you respond. And if they were to say, well, I just don't believe that stuff happens, and you say, like what? And they go, on afterlife, then sometimes I'll go, time out. Let's talk about near-death experiences. And I'll talk about that. If they say, well, I just don't believe there's a God, I might go, okay, time out. Then you tell me what happened to Jesus. If you can't explain the resurrection away, tell me how he came back from dead as a doornail when we don't know how to bring life back. Or what about the other arguments for God, the Kalam argument, the moral argument? What do you do with those? So I think we have to be versatile. But a lot of times the people are touched by afterlife stories. They're touched by afterlife experiences. So I'll use near-death experiences as a way to open the door to get into afterlife. And then I will use afterlife as a way to say, well, if there's already an afterlife, what do you do with the resurrection? That's a specific species of afterlife. So I think it comes from being versatile and caring for the person, right? We're just not trying to go off on them and make everybody mad at us. Right. We're trying to help them. And so I think it comes from really trying to understand and help and talk, because, the old saying, there go I, but for the grace of God. I mean, that's me. I was a doubter for many years, more than 10 years, closer to 20 years. I was a doubter. And there were stages where I won't even tell you my views. I just held views that were very non-Christian views. And I didn't know how to get out of them. So I try to understand the person and their pain. But here's my bottom line. I want them to respond to my data. I don't want them to tell me how they feel. I don't want them to tell me, well, I just can't go along with that. And I'll say, well, why not? What's wrong with this? If you hold my view, and I'll tell them and I'll tease, humor does a lot sometimes. And I'll say, come on, don't be afraid to tell me my view of the universe is a very pretty view. This is a beautiful view of the universe. It all hangs together really well. Bart Ehrman, now I have not seen this, but somebody sent me a quote that they said comes from his book on the afterlife. And again, it's hearsay until I see it, but they sent me a quote where he says, sure, I would like to believe in a good life after death. He said, no, I don't. He said, I don't believe in an afterlife. I'm an atheist, but I hope there's a nice afterlife for everybody. Okay, time out. Let's talk about a nice afterlife. Let's talk about near-death experiences. So I want to see where the person's coming from and treat them pastorally and kind of treat them like I would want to be treated. Yeah,
that's well said. And I think on that note, maybe just one more question and we'll let you go. I know you're busy with everything that's going on out there.
That's right.
So with regards to miracles, sometimes people will say, or I know there's this quote by Blaise Pascal that I really like. It says, if there was no obscurity, man would not be sensible of his corruption. And if there was no light, man would not hope for a remedy. Thus, it's not only fair, but advantageous to us that God is be partly hidden and partly revealed, since it's equally dangerous to man to know God without knowing his own wretchedness and to know his own wretchedness without knowing God. And J.P. Moreland has said similar things. And this is kind of the whole hiddenness of God thing. And why doesn't God do more miracles? And so my simple little answer is, well, by definition, a miracle is a rare event. So if it happens all the time, it's not a miracle. That's one reason. But what would you say as far as, so we have near-death experiences, which you don't have to necessarily say those are miracles, but they enter another sphere that's not purely natural. But with regards to the resurrection specifically, as you said, that's the central point. What about that particular miracle, as you've said, that if he's a false prophet, God's not going to raise a false prophet. So what about the significance of that miracle
exactly
stands out? And correct me if I'm wrong on this too, because I think and there's all the prophecies in the Old Testament, the prophecy of the Messiah being resurrected on earth, that's not one of them. That was kind of a surprise, I guess. Now we can look at Psalm 22 and say, okay, there's evidence that crucifixion might have been prophesied, but the central fact of the resurrection being that type of miracle, what does that tell us about God doing miracles, or the purpose of miracles, I guess is what I'm trying to say. Because sometimes people want to pray for a miracle every day, but would that really be in the interest of God?
Well, it depends. It depends on who you are, what you're going through. God answers prayers certain times, not other times. Yeah. I'm in my library, and the books straight across behind my computer are 2 volumes by Craig Keener, over 1,000 pages of contemporary miracle claims. And some of these, many of them are just stories, and he acknowledges that. Many of them are just stories, but many of them have pre and post CAT scans, pre and post MRIs, pre and post X-rays, pre and post eyewitnesses, pre and post eyewitnesses with non-Christians. And some of these are just amazing. And here, that's one level. Here's another one. There are at least 2 experiments that I know of that have been written up in medical journals, peer-reviewed secular medical journals, of double-blind prayer, fulfilled prayer, where prayers were answered and people got better, statistically better, good enough that the studies were published in 2 different medical journals, secular medical journals. Here's a third aspect. Jesus is proclaimed in the New Testament as a miracle worker. Today, this will blow people's minds if they haven't heard it, but today, critics, atheist New Testament scholars, agnostic New Testament scholars, more than not, a very high percentage believe that Jesus healed and exorcised demons, or what they believe were demons, while he was walking. These critics believe Jesus healed. And what's going on? If Jesus heals, there's healings today, there's double-blind prayers, I think we better take a new look at the world. I think we better look around at the world around us.
Very, very, very good points. And on that note, let me just leave everybody that hope, because if the resurrection is true, we have hope. And if we believe in the one who was resurrected, we have hope. And so that's good news, AKA the gospel. So thank you so much, Dr. Habermas. I really, truly appreciate it. It's a pleasure. It was a pleasure taking your class, a pleasure having you on tonight. I know you're really busy, but I appreciate you taking a little bit of time to stop and chat with us and give us some of your knowledge.
You're welcome, Alex. Glad to be on your show. Glad to meet you face to face. I'm proud of you being a graduate of Liberty University. I'm glad you're not just a graduate of Liberty. You did your graduate degree in apologetics. And I'm proud that you're pursuing a secular PhD. I mean, don't let it be said that Christians are afraid to face evidences, afraid to face arguments from other places. You're thinking about going to a secular university, from what I understand. More power to you. I hope you carry on. And most of all, as I tell all my students and everybody, in Proverbs chapter 4, the proverb says, mind your heart, because all the things of life come out of your heart. So sometimes it's not the evidence that floors us, it's the pain, it's the suffering, it's someone that gives us a raw deal. So I would say to your listeners, let's keep our heart in line as well as we keep our head in line.
Absolutely. Well said. And thank you. Thank you again. Good night, everybody. And stay tuned. We got some more things exciting coming out next week. Good night.
Thanks, Alex.